Welcome to the Bible in Our Culture, an outreach radio ministry of Liberty Remnant Church, where we encourage you to view the culture through the lens of the Holy Bible.
Welcome to the Bible and Our Culture, the radio show where we look at the culture through the lens of Scripture. My name's Jay McPherson with Liberty Remnant Church. Glad to have you with us. We have been taking quite a while over the last month or so to look at the story of Gideon and how his life, his ministry affects us today. If you'll remember the story of Gideon, he started out hiding in a cave from the Midianites, asking God, why is this happening? Why are they oppressed? God showed up and told him he was going to deliver his people through Gideon. And Gideon's freaked out. I don't know if I can do this. I feel like I'm a failure. I'm inadequate. I'm inferior. You really can't use me, can you? And God's like, you are a mighty man of valor because I am with you and I have called you and I have sent you. Great encouragement for us today. Well, if you know the story of Gideon, he stood up, showed up, spoke up, and God worked an amazing miracle. Just him and 300 guys took on multiple armies, a huge confederation of armies. You couldn't even number all the soldiers. You couldn't even number the camels. And God showed up and worked a great miracle. Gideon used his wisdom to enforce that miracle and bring freedom to God's people, to bring liberty. Well, Gideon backslid. He got cocky. We talked about it last week. Gideon seemed to think he was all that, and the glory that was owed God, Gideon kind of took for himself. As a young man, he was humble, but as he grew up, he kind of grew cocky. The children of Israel wanted to give him the throne. Well, he admirably refused it. He was under the anointing and grace of God, but subtly he began to act like a king more and more as time went on. Pride creeped in, and eventually Gideon named his son Abimelech. Well, Abimelech means my father is king. So he thought, yeah, I'm pretty much king after all. He refused it, but he only really refused the duty and responsibility and burden of being king. He took the perks. He took money from the public treasury and controlled it. He made a glorious ephod, a priestly garment, a fancy one that only the high priest would wear. And he began to function as an unofficial high priest. He led God's people to backsliding. Well, here's the weird story. He's kind of king, but kind of not. He's kind of high priest, but kind of not. This blur is really unhealthy. He used that to control the situation, control the money of God's people, and led them to terrible demise. They ended up becoming a nation of civil war with much bloodshed because of Gideon's pride and being loosey-goosey with his role. Either be the king or don't. Either be the high priest or don't. Well, he couldn't be the high priest because he wasn't a descendant of Aaron. I guess he identified as a descendant of Aaron. So after all the victories in Judges 8, we read this last week, verse 26, said the weight of the gold earrings that he requested. Gideon requested, hey, I'm not going to be king, but please give me all the gold earrings from the plunder. Well, it weighed 1,700 shekels of gold, and the crescent ornaments, the pendants, the purple robes, which were on the kings of Midian, and besides, the chains that were around the camels' necks. So he asked for just earrings, and he ends up with all sorts of stuff. In verse 27, Gideon made it into an ephod and set it up in the city, his city, Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and his house. Well, Gideon was, in a way, trans. What do you mean by that? Well, it wasn't transgender. He was acting like a king representing the civil government. But apparently, he identified as a descendant of Aaron to act as the high priest of the Levitical order. He was not from the tribe of Levi. He was from the tribe of Manasseh. His roles were way too blurry. Was he governing with the civil arena or the religious arena? Was he part of the church or was he part of the state? Therein lies a big question, the separation of church and state. I want to talk about the separation of church and state, what it really means. Some of you might know, but I'm going to guess 90% or more of you don't know. There's a show on this radio station, Church and State. My friends Gabe and Caleb, they know about the true separation of church and state, but many don't. Well, since 1947, Everson versus the Board of Education, secularists have read the First Amendment as separation of church and state and have successfully fooled the public to think that the phrase separation of church and state is in the Constitution. It is not. It is not, but it's the power of repetition on people that don't really want to learn. It seems like recent generations of America, people don't really want to understand their rights and responsibilities as citizens. And they just sort of go along with the popular opinion. And if you repeat something often enough and loud enough, no matter how ridiculous it is, people will still tend to believe what they hear over and over again. Even some Christian attorneys specializing in constitutional law think the phrase separation of church and state is in the Constitution. My man David Barton of Wall Builders Ministries, he does a lot to stand up for religious freedom. And he was talking to a newly elected representative to Congress, a Republican, a Christian, and a constitutional law lawyer. And he starts talking about how our Christian liberties are being under assault. And the new freshman representative says, well, we can't do anything about that because of the separation of church and state. And David Barton tells the story. He's like, what do you mean the separation of church and state? Well, it's in the Constitution, separation of church and state. David Barton's like, no, it's not. Yeah, it is. I've been to constitutional law school and I passed the bar exam. Of course, I would know separation of church and state is in the Constitution. He's like, no. And he showed him that it wasn't. Here's the funny thing. They've tried to limit freedom of religion to freedom of worship so as to keep us hidden away. We're free to practice our religion. That is, we can worship God how we think he wants to be worshiped. We can share the gospel with people. But they don't want to make it freedom of religion. They want to make it freedom of worship. In other words, you can do what you want just so long as you're hidden away on Sunday mornings inside the church. We don't want any public expression of Christianity. We don't want to hear the gospel. That is not freedom of religion. That might be freedom of worship by some people's definition, but it is not freedom of religion. So here is what the First Amendment actually says. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the First Amendment in regards to religion. But today, people really only want to emphasize the first clause. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. And they almost whisper, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Shh, we don't like that part. They emphasize one aspect, but don't get the whole picture. And even the part that they do emphasize is still great if you properly understand it. Many secularists and the evil spiritual forces behind them frame this confused phrase, separation of church and state, as separation of God and civil government. It is not. We are one nation under God. Our national motto is, in God we trust. There is no separation of God and civil government. There is a separation, I believe, of the church and their government and the civil arena and their governments. The governments are to be kept separate. But that's not how the secularists today want to see it, and that's not how many have been squeezed into their mold to see it. Some would even say, well, it's the separation of God in the public square. We don't want God in the public square. That's not how the founders thought when they were writing the Bill of Rights. Some would even say, well, it must be the separation of Christianity and life. We don't want to see any life Christianity. It's like it's something illegal. As long as you do it behind closed doors and we don't have to see it and we don't have to concern ourselves with it, then it's okay. The separation of Christianity and real life. But they want their secular humanist philosophy imposed through the force of the state. They're like, we're objective, we're secular, and we're going to make everybody agree with us. This is absolutely the discrimination that the First Amendment was trying to prevent. I'm serious. Back when the Bill of Rights were signed and ratified, there really wasn't secularism. There was just views on God, different denominations. And so everybody had a religious view. And today I'm saying everybody has a religious view as well, just some of them attack religion. And they think they're objective when they say they're secular. You can't be objective. Only God is objective. The proper way to be objective is to worship the right God. But they think we're above and beyond religion, and so our views can be imposed through the force of the state. No, back in the day, there was no Darwin's theory of evolution, back in the days of the founding. And so everybody had a view, and some were Anglican, and some were Baptist, and some were Presbyterian, and so on. But everybody had a view. Well, the idea was you couldn't use the force of the state to convert people to your philosophy of religion. Today, people are trying to use the force of the state to convert people to their philosophy of religion. They want to remove nativity displays at Christmas time because of the separation of church and state. What? That doesn't make any sense. They want to tear down crosses that were put at a roundabout as a tribute to the World War I vets or World War I soldiers who died in conflict. They have all this private money and they raise money. They make this nice cross in order to honor those who died in World War I. Well, then they give it to the state so that they can come and, repair the sprinklers and and mow the lawn and all that. And now people are outraged. You can't have a cross on city property. Well, where does the First Amendment fit any of this? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Tear down the cross that's on public property. There's no law that Congress has passed. That doesn't make any sense. If you have a nativity scene at the courthouse or at City Hall, that's not Congress passing a law. They don't really care about the First Amendment at all. They've perverted it, and now they are overriding it with their own agenda. Of course, they want to tear down displays of the Ten Commandments. They don't even want an assistant football coach in the state of Washington praying in public quietly after football games. Can you imagine how crazy this is? Where did Congress make a law commanding this assistant football coach to kneel at the 50-yard line quietly and pray after games? Well, he can't do it because of the separation of church and state. What are you talking about? He's a free individual. And right here in Spokane, Washington, they denounce the recent mayor for attending an unapproved worship service. And this resolution denouncing the mayor mentioned the separation of church and state. How dare the mayor go to a worship service where we're praying for fire victims and so on? We didn't approve that. And so they made this big to-do about it. And guess what? Got that mayor unelected. Got their secular mayor put into office. We got a new city council president who was pushing this. They worked their political agenda through the phrase of separation of church and state, and it was terrible. It was an injustice. I remember as a kid, back in 1989, 88-89 basketball season, I was on a Christian school. We were number one in state. We ended up winning state after all. And we would hand out tracts at the end of a game. We have a little note card and maybe write a note to one of the players that we were competing against. And it had a tract of Pistol Pete Maravich, who had a great testimony, a great basketball story, the best college player ever. Went into the pros. He got involved in alcohol and lost his meaning for life and radically came to Jesus. What a great story, great basketball story and a great story of the gospel. So we'd give a little track about Pistol Pete Maravich and him coming to Jesus. And we handed him out. Well, there was another private school, not a Christian school, but a private school in Spokane, where one of the players was offended. How dare they give us tracts at a WIAA basketball game? That's the Washington Interscholastic Athletic Association basketball game. They shouldn't do that. Separation of church and state. Separation of church and state. They wrote an article in the local paper, and it was covered, and then somebody else did a big article, misquoted our athletic director. It was a big mess, and we ended up not being able to give out tracts. Now, looking back on it, I would think we should have fought that. But the way things were, the school just says, you know what, we just won't give out tracts. We'll have a pizza party for the players after the game. Which that was cool because I got free pizza. When you're a high school kid playing sports, you love free pizza. And we got to get to know the players more individually one-on-one. It was actually pretty cool. But the whole idea of why we couldn't hand out tracts at the end of a basketball game had to do with the phony, baloney version of separation in church and state. Congress did not make a law to enforce us handing out tracts. Congress did not make a law to say the mayor had to go to the worship service here in Spokane. They're just making up garbage. Many religious symbols were displayed in public during the Bill of Rights era, before and after. And here's the thing. This has to do with what the federal government can't do. According to the First Amendment, state, county, and city governments are still free to do what they want. But don't tell that to the secularist. Well, even the federal government is under God, as we say in the Pledge of Allegiance. And our national motto truly is, "In God we trust." We must continue to trust God, or the American civil government isn't going to work right. And guess what? We aren't trusting God, so the government in America is not working right. There's corruption. There's baloney. There's inflation. There's depression. There's suicide. There's anxiety. It's a big mess because we aren't a nation truly under God anymore. We don't trust God. We should. And if we did, solve a lot of our problems. But because we're arrogant, like Gideon, we're suffering the consequences of not trusting God. God was honored on the floor of the Independence Hall during the founding. And many of the founding speeches, many letters, prayers before battle, on and on it goes. God has been center. The God of the Bible has been center through American history. Let's take a quick break, and I'll be back in just a moment.
About 4 years ago, Liberty Remnant Church was founded in North Spokane by a group of committed Christ followers believing that God sought to build a distinct local church for His glory. LRC is a simple, relational, biblical church that is not afraid to apply biblical principles to weighty current-day issues. In fact, we feel God expects it of His church. Pastor Jay McPherson hosts a regular radio show on this station called The Bible and Our Culture. Like on the radio program, LRC believes God has called His church to represent Christ's love, power, and wisdom in any and every facet of our society. If you're looking for a local church or know someone who is, please consider what God is doing at Liberty Remnant Church. Sunday service is at 10 a.m. just a block east of Newport Highway on 4301 East Day, Mount Spokane Road. For more information or to contact our pastor, please check out our website at libertyremnantchurch.org.
Glad to have you with us. We've been looking at the story of Gideon and how his demise, he kind of became king, but he kind of became high priest. And there was this blur of the duties of king and the duties of high priest. In other words, there was a blur of separation of church and state that I think is legitimate. But like we were saying earlier, the phrase separation of church and state has become to mean the exact opposite of what it was really intended to mean when Thomas Jefferson first used it in the letter to the Danbury Baptist. We're going to look at that here in a little bit. But we've been taking a peek at how ridiculous this whole concept of separation of church and state is. It's been perverted 180 degrees. So much of what was happening during the founding era was giving God glory for our nation, that we were a nation under God. There's been a ton of things that we have done over the years and still do today that shows that we respect God in America. During the founding era, the schoolhouse was often the church house, right? So they'd have church, people would build a building to have church in, and they'd also have school in it. It's kind of how they did a Little House on the Prairie, for those of you that are old enough to remember that show from the 70s and 80s, and I think even into the 90s. But of course, pastors would preach the gospel and pray during open sessions of Congress. Representatives would often quote the Bible frequently as a source of authority. Even the Capitol Rotunda would host Sunday service every Sunday rent-free. Get this, tax dollars were used to print Bibles and fund missionaries. Now, I don't agree with that personally. I think the burden of printing Bibles and sending missionaries should be upon the church, not upon the state. But that's how there was so much agreement on the founders that, hey, we need to be a great nation. Let's spend some tax money to print a bunch of Bibles, and let's fund some missionaries to go take these Bibles to the Native Americans so that they can be saved. Way different than the way we think nowadays. But we still put our hand on the Bible for sworn testimony or inaugurating public servants into office. Our national motto is, "In God We Trust." The Pledge of Allegiance pledges we are one nation under God. And of course, our birth certificate as a nation, the Declaration of Independence, declares our right to exist comes from God. The founders were appealing to heaven is why America should be its own nation. They believed that God had given us individual, inalienable rights, and the laws of nature's God give us that freedom. So this concept of separation of church and state, as it's spun today, is complete lies. Religion, in that time, is the same as philosophy or worldview today. That is, everybody had a religious view of some sort, just as everybody has a philosophy or worldview today. And they didn't want a denomination or quote-unquote church controlling everyone else. But now, an antichrist worldview seems to feel it can control everybody and everyone else. What about climate change? How about we have a separation of climate change and state? I can see that the climate change cult is a religious, really self-righteous, have all these practices that what's good and what's bad, their standard of ethics and their standard of behavior. They've kind of become their own religion. They are certainly a philosophy or worldview, but we should have a separation of climate change and state. How would they like that? I think it's a great idea. Or how about the concept of separation of secularism and state? Secularism is a view on religion. It's a view about God. So you can't have that in the state if you're going to have separation of church and state the way you talk about it. No secularism in the state. Or how about this one? Separation of socialism and state. Socialism is a philosophy, but it's a philosophy that puts their trust in the government, the civil government, to be God. The state is the socialist God. The state is the socialist protection, the socialist high tower, the socialist refuge and provider. So how are you going to have a separation of socialism and state? It's crazy what they've done. So as I mentioned earlier, the phrase came from a letter from newly elected President Thomas Jefferson. It was in reply to the Danbury Baptist Church in Connecticut. Now, why is that significant? Well, I think it's significant because Connecticut was thought of as a Congregationalist church, a Congregationalist state. And so the Baptists were kind of a minority as far as denominations go in Connecticut. But through the colonial period, each colony kind of had their dominant church or denomination. And for generations in Europe, the quote-unquote divine right of kings decided what religion his people would observe. The king said, well, I'm Anglican, like Henry VIII did. You're all going to be Anglicans. And then Bloody Mary said, no, I'm going to be Catholic, and I'm going to force everybody to be Catholics. Well, how sincere is your faith? How sincere is your religion if the king is forcing it upon you? So there's a lot of talk that says, we can't have this. It's got to be a personal thing. Your faith, your religion has to be between you and God. You have to answer to your own conscience. You can't have a king telling you how you ought to conduct your religion. And so until then, everybody thought, well, each state had its own official church, its own official denomination. You had the Pennsylvania colony was Quakers, and it seemed like Virginia was Anglican, and I can't remember how they all went, but up and down the east coast of America, there were certain states that had their preferred official denomination. Well, Jefferson, when he was a young lawyer, he defended Baptists in Anglican Virginia, where Jefferson was from. So when Jefferson's elected president, well, here come these Baptists saying, hey, we want to make sure Thomas Jefferson's going to support us because we're a religious minority here in the state of Connecticut. The question was, if the colonies unite as one nation, which denomination or which religion would be the official church of the new United States of America? Well, that's where this idea of religious liberty really came about. That we can't have an official religion. We're going to have a separation, if you will, of church and state. We're not going to have an official church denomination, state denomination, but we are going to be a nation under God. So this Baptist church was uncomfortable with the idea that the Bill of Rights granted them or anyone the right to worship. They're saying, hey, if the Bill of Rights grants us the right to worship, that means the government could take it away. And we believe that our right to worship is inalienable, that nobody can take it from us. This is what they wrote, and I quote, this is the Danbury Baptist writing to Thomas Jefferson. Therefore, what religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights. They're saying, hey, we're the minority. We don't want to take a favor from the state to worship as we feel the worship. We want it to be inalienable from God that no government could ever take from us. And Jefferson, who long claimed religious rights were inalienable gifts from God, he replied, and I quote, this is a portion of his letter back, I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, end quote. This is where the phrase separation of church and state came from. It actually was a wall of separation between church and state. Now, if you look at the First Amendment, the word separation isn't there. The word church isn't there. The word state isn't there. Not even the word between is. But of is in the First Amendment. So I guess we have to concede something, right? I guess if we're good Christians, we'll concede everything because of is in the phrase separation of church and state, and of is also in the First Amendment. Well, that's it. Just the word of is like the only connection between these two concepts. Well, I think there's a connection in concepts, but literally, those are the only words that transpose from one to the other. Now, here's what's interesting. 2 days later, Jefferson would go to the Capitol, where he faithfully attended church most every Sunday. If he was in town, he was going to go to church at the Capitol building. With so much construction at that time in Washington, D.C., few church buildings had been built. So Congress funded what would be called an interdenominational service in the Capitol building. And of course, politicians love to go to the interdenominational service so they didn't take anybody off. Churches took place in the Capitol building 2 years before Congress took place in the Capitol building. How about that? Attendance was sometimes over 2,000 people and often filled above capacity. Tax dollars paid for the hymnals and likely the guest preacher's honorariums. Both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, had their own chaplains who organized these events. Generations later, up to 4 different denominations met in the Capitol each Sunday. This practice of having church in the Capitol continued until at least 1868, 4 years after the Civil War. Reverend Henry Garnet preached in the Capitol on February 12, 1865, shortly after the passage of the 13th Amendment. Well, what's the significance of that? Well, Garnet was born a slave, but escaped and became a Presbyterian minister and chaplain in the Civil War. So after the 13th Amendment was passed, which ended slavery, here is a former slave preaching in the Capitol building that following Sunday. And of course, with all this, nobody ever screamed, separation of church and state, separation of church and state. Why? Because Congress was not forcing people to go to church, but allowing religious expression to occur. That's their job. Allow religious expression to occur. That's what you're supposed to do according to the Constitution if you're Congress. Not force people, but not prohibit people. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. They were not controlling religion, but making room for it. That's what the Constitution instructs them to do. So let's take a quick summary here. We're going to probably have to continue this on the next show. The phrase separation of church and state came from a letter of Thomas Jefferson, newly elected president, to a minority denomination, the Danbury Baptist in Connecticut, telling them that the state would not interfere with their practice of religion. It has been perverted. It has been twisted. It has been flip-flopped 180 degrees to do the exact opposite of what it was supposed to do. We're going to talk more about that next time in part 2 of the true meaning of the separation of church and state.
Thank you for listening to The Bible and Our Culture, an outreach radio ministry of Liberty Remnant Church. If you would like to help support this ministry, you can go to our website, libertyremnantchurch.org/give, and select Radio Ministry. See you next week at this same time.